Okay, this video is going to show you how to create a custom validator. Okay, these are important for when you're doing jobs that are more complex and require queries to the database. Now this is our registration system, and we've got this login name, but we don't want people to have the same login names. Obviously they need to be unique, whatever it is we're asking them to use, whether it's an email address or not, or whether it's just a made up username. In order to do this, there is a validator for this. So if we look at our validators, I'm in my toolbox here and I'm having a custom validator. So I'm going to drag this on. Okay, now I'm going to change the ID of it first of all. So I've got my properties open, so VD unique login names, that's what I'm going to call it. Control to validate, a little bit wider. Is login name. Put this dynamic display thing on, and the error message. So it's the same four things I need to set. Now this time, my error message should be sorry, login name already exists. Now we're not going to be fancy and give a list of suggestions of potential names that don't exist. That's a load of work. That could be an entire project in itself to do that cleverly. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to now create a subroutine. Now if you look at the top of the property window, there's a little events button, and we want to run a server validation. Okay, so we're going to use this to query. So it doesn't exist, so we're just going to double click it and it's created it for us. Okay, so this is where we're going to put our code to check for our valid username. Okay, now it's slightly different to the code. Let me just get rid of the toolbox. Slightly different to normal code, because what we've got to do is we've got to make a decision and make the validation for the page bad. Okay, after our outcome of our decision. Now in order to do this, we need to check to see if a user exists with the login name, so we need to do a query. Alright, so we're going to do a query, and if we find, what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to get the username. And you can do this lots of different ways, but I'm going to get the user ID if it exists for a username. So if I get a user ID, then I'll know that that user login name already exists. Okay, so I'm going to say if, and I'm going to put this as part of my data helpers. Doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to call it user ID for login name. Now I might actually use this in other parts of my systems. Right, where do we get the argument? We don't know when this is run. It's not up to us. It's going to come from the text box, but this parameter here, args, has got the information that we need to validate. So with the other validators, they're going to do this work for us. So we want the args.value. Okay, if I don't find a username, I'm going to return user ID of -1, so I can test for that. So that's what I'm going to test for. So I'm going to say if the user ID that I get back is equals -1, i.e. the user doesn't exist, then I'm going to say yeah, great, that's valid. So args.is valid equals true. So I'm telling the validator that everything's kosher, let that username exist because it doesn't sit in our database anywhere. Okay, if we don't get -1, that means that login name does exist, so we're going to make the validation fail. Okay, so let's just look. So if you create your own validators, this is the format. Okay, so we need to create this. It doesn't exist, this subroutine, so let's create it. So we're going to say right click, generate method stub, and it'll create it in the data one for us. Alright, so if we now right click on that, it'll take us to it. Go to definition, you can press F12 as well. First thing, put an XML comment in. So locate attempt to locate user ID for given login login name. And in the returns one we can say user ID or -1 if login name does not exist. So I'm just, and it's created and called the parameter p, which is a nav name, so I'm going to rename that parameter and I'm going to have it as login name. Change it there in the parameter tag, login name. So that is login name to look for. Gone on eBay. Right. So what we need to do is write a query. So we're going to write a query that is going to determine this number for us. So you'll get used to writing these queries. So I just want the user ID. Even though this is a short query, I'm still doing it on separate lines. So from, and looking at me Server Explorer, I can see that my table is called TBL user. Remember, you've got a username of your stuff. Remember, that space is critical. You'll get SQL error if you don't leave that space. And we're going to use a where clause. So I'm going to say where the login name, which I called f login name in my table, equals the parameter that I'm going to set. Okay. So I need to create a parameter collection. And again, you'll get used to doing this, and you can, if you want, copy and paste lines, but be careful when you copy paste. Saves time until you find a bug that you can't track down. So I'm going to add the parameter, and the only parameter I've got is this login name. So a new parameter, we called it question mark. Its type is text, so type code.string, and it is our parameter for this subroutine, which is login name. Okay, so that's the parameter. I want to run a query that retrieves data, so that's going to be my execute and fill helper, which needs to store the information in a data view. So data view dv equals execute and fill that SQL with that parameter. Again, when I get my data back, so you can say if dv.count is greater than 0, so I've found something, let's return the integer from that first record of the field user ID. Okay, so we did find a user account. So I'm making this more general, and I'm going to return -1 if we didn't have any records. So if we didn't have any records, that means we're good to go with our user ID. Okay, so all we've done is we've asked for the user IDs for a particular login name, set it up in the same way. If we did find some records, we send that user ID back. If we didn't, we send -1 back. Okay, so let's go back to our registration code. That's what we were looking for. So if the login name equals -1, then we've got validation which we want to be true. We're happy. Okay. Now, the only problem with this is it doesn't automatically stop me submitting data. I have to ask the page if it's valid. Okay, which seems a bit skanky, but it isn't too much work. So all of our code for our click needs to be wrapped up in an if. So right at the top, I'm going to put a brace, and right at the bottom, I'm going to put a brace. Okay, you can put braces anywhere, and that should have all indented. Now I'm going to put this block of code, I only want to happen if the page is valid. Okay, so I'm just going to say if is valid. So that's asking if the page is valid. Okay, so let's have a look at what we did. We added this new custom validator. We set in its events, after we set all the properties, we double clicked server validate, which created this subroutine. We put this data in that said we're looking for a number of -1 from this subroutine that we created. if we get -1, we want the validation to be fine. If we don't get -1, we want it to be invalid. We created this little helper next to user ID for login, which just searched for the user ID for a given login name. If we found that login name, we return the user ID. If we didn't, we return -1, which is what we were hoping for the validation. Let's just see if it works. Now, in order to test this, I need to remember. Let's just minimize that while that's chugging. I need to remember one of my user login names, Dave. So I've got Dave. So if I try and put another Dave in, this shouldn't work. Let's bring Internet Explorer back up. Right, so I'm going to put Dave, screen name, Dave2, because I think I'm being clever. Password, I'm just going to put 1234, 1234. So let's try register details now. Sorry, login name already exists. So I'm going to call him login name Dave2. And it hopefully, welcome back Dave2. So if we look, refresh our table, right click on it, right click over it and say execute. There you go, Dave2's gone in. But it wouldn't let me put Dave in twice. Okay, the next one's going to allow you to put some admin controls in.